Well, hello again. We're now up to week number 5 in Policy, Politics, and Law of Higher Education. And I'm going to give you some tips that will help you work through the materials for week 5 and also the assignment for week 5. Let's get to the assignment first. It's due on Sunday next week at midnight, and what I'd like you to do is to write, it's described in the Angel website, a memo to the president of the university, the new president, Michael Hogan of the University of Illinois, explaining what happened at the University of Illinois before he got there in terms of the Clout University scandal. This had to do with university admissions at the University of Illinois, particularly at the Champaign-Urbana campus. In a nutshell, people of influence were asking for special consideration for certain persons who otherwise might not have been admitted to programs where the admissions policies were highly selective at this flagship institution. There was a dearth of adequate policy, a lack of adequate policy, and as a result, the University of Illinois suffered some damaging stories in the Chicago Tribune and then other papers and other media outlets as well. This led eventually to the resignation of several trustees and even the resignation of the president of the University of Illinois, who at first kind of dismissed this as a tempest in a teapot, but ended up paying with his job. The point of the assignment is to see what sort of savvy you have after working through the materials of week 5 in terms of recommending policy for the university to use to avert a problem. Sometimes I say in jest that you can look through the policy books of most colleges and universities and by reading the policies discover all the things that have ever gone wrong there, because as soon as the horse gets out of the barn, somebody says we need a policy on that, they write a policy, it goes into the policy book, and the policy book becomes too much or too late and too little, too late. That's not the right approach to policy. That's not how policy ought to function, but sometimes in fact that's the way it does function. I'm going to recommend that you take another look at the policy making from a different perspective and take a look at the work of John Carver, whose theories are summarized in the terms policy governance. If you look at the multimedia part of the week 5 materials, you'll see their materials from John Carver. They will lead you to John Carver's writings on policy governance. Policy governance is a pretty simple concept, really, although it's fairly new. The idea is that the rule of the board as the ultimate authority when it comes to the policy for an institution ought to be exercised gently, noting the fact that the board has the power to intervene its judgment across the board. The board can get involved in the minutest decision on the university campus if it wants to. It has the legal power to do that. But while it's getting involved in the day-to-day operations, it's forfeiting its chance to provide real leadership, futuristic leadership to the institution, to the college or the university. So the idea in policy governance is to first of all realize that the board has ultimate and far-reaching authority, and second, that the board should seldom exercise all of that authority directly. Instead, it should delegate that authority with some guidelines, with some policy guidelines. The board should say, and this is Carver's nomenclature, that it expects that there will be on the campus allowed nothing illegal, nothing immoral, and nothing imprudent. And with those 3 major guidelines in place, then the rest of the campus can go about making policy that will produce the kind of processes and the kinds of results that the board expects. The board also has to be very explicit, speaking of results, about what kind of result it's looking for. Is the institution there to prepare people for the workforce? Is it there to prepare people to think on a mature level? Or some combination of the two. The board needs to lay out its expectations for the institution, and then it needs to check to make sure that those expectations are being realized. That's the board's job, to say what the institution is for, to say what it expects in terms of results, to check to make sure those results are being achieved, and then to lay out some basic guidelines, which in policy governance are called executive limitations, that say you can use any method you want to produce these results except nothing illegal, nothing imprudent, nothing immoral. If the board wants to go inside the circle, as Carver says, and be more explicit about what it means about nothing imprudent, nothing unethical, nothing immoral, it can do so. I'll give you an example. I've seen institutions, state institutions on the border of a state, say in the East St. Louis area, hire presidents who didn't want to live in district. They lived in the adjoining state. So they ended up driving around the district where people were paying their taxes to the support of the college, and they were seeing the president drive a college car, or maybe her own or his own car, doesn't really make any difference, but with a Missouri license plate. Now, how would that make you feel if you were on the Illinois side of the river, you were paying Illinois taxes to support an Illinois institution, and the president of the institution was driving a car that had Missouri license plates? Actually, that's imprudent, but it might be the sort of thing that a new president wouldn't pick up on quickly. So the board might want to come in the circle a little bit and say, for example, when we say nothing imprudent, we include these things. We don't want the president to do this and this and this. You can, if you're at the board level, make those kinds of restrictions, or lay down those kinds of restrictions or executive limitations on the performance of the president. And then the president does the same for the vice presidents do the same for the deans for the department chairs for the faculty, and so on. It ratchets down through the entire institution. That's how policy governance works. It's a way of getting ahead of the game, so that instead of the policy book being a record of all the things that have ever gone wrong at the college or the university, it's sort of a blueprint for how the institution is to move into the future, the kinds of resources it's to have, the kinds of results it's to have, and the expectations that are placed on the people that work for the institution. Policy governance is a very promising new approach to policy making, and I want you to be familiar with it, because you're going to run into it. You're going to run into people who are talking to you about policy governance, and I want you to know what it really is. There's also a reading in multimedia from the University of California about how to write a good campus policy. I think that's something that you'll want to take a look at. There are readings on shared governance and unionization or collective bargaining on campus. Both of those place some limitation on policy making. Let's take them one by one. First of all, shared governance. Shared governance is a very, very old idea. It really derives from the evolution of the university in Europe 1,000 years ago or so, when universities were first formed, first at the University of Paris and then in other major cities of Europe. The idea was that the faculty would own the university. In fact, the colleagues coming together is what formed the university. The word university itself, universitas, is the Latin word for faculty union. And the idea of collegiality, or a collegiate sharing of responsibility, comes from the idea of colleagues, academically proficient colleagues getting together, offering courses. The reason that academic robes have pockets is because in the old days, 1,000 years ago, when students went to class, they put their tuition money in the pocket of the professor. So the more students that a professor had, the more money he made, and the more he prospered. It's a real sense of ownership, literally, on the part of the faculty. And this idea has carried over until the current time, in which most faculty feel that they have a right to make the critical decisions about instruction. The American Association of University Professors published a statement on this, and that's one of your readings. I wanted you to know about the AAUP's involvement in the idea of shared governance. The notion is that the board is responsible for the legal and the financial setup of the university, but they should delegate the academic responsibility to the president, and that he in turn should delegate that responsibility to the faculty. So there's a sharing of responsibility. The administrators take care of the day-to-day business activities of the university. The trustees take responsibility for the long-term direction of the university, and the faculty take responsibility for day-to-day instruction. That means things like selection of textbooks, and the way the course is delivered, and the way students are admitted to programs and then judged in terms of their success, whether they deserve to be a graduate of the program all that is traditionally delegated to the faculty, and that's called shared governance. In the 20th century, the success of trade unions in several trades, trucking, plumbing, electronics, and so on, gave rise to the idea amongst professors that they should use some of the same methods to ensure some degree of involvement in the way that the college or university in which they worked was run. And following the example of public school employees who formed unions, college professors began to do the same thing. There was an important legal decision called the yeshiva decision in the 20th century that said that these rights to form and operate a union extended to professors, but not to professors at private colleges and universities, because there it was assumed that the faculty were in effect management, and you can't both be the union and management at the same time. Therefore, you don't find these days very many unions, particularly faculty unions, at the private colleges and universities of America. And yet collective bargaining has had a distinct influence on the formation of the community colleges, most of which sprang up after the popularization of academic collective bargaining. And today, most of the colleges in the larger states, such as California and New York and New Jersey and Illinois, are governed with a very careful respect on the part of the board and the president for the unions, particularly the faculty union. So that influences the way that the president and the board will make policy. They'll not try to get themselves in trouble in terms of the state's collective bargaining law and the policies that they make. They will, in the policies that they make, extend certain rights and privileges to the union and to the faculty. That's something to keep in mind, because if you find yourself in an environment where collective bargaining is actually being used, it will influence your approach to policy making. Now, as far as policy making is concerned, let me say just a couple of things. Policy has to have a reason. There ought to be a reason for the policies that an institution has. Some policies we can live without, we found. When I started college in the early 60s, particularly for women, the colleges assumed that they were stand-ins for the parents of the students. So they felt the right to make policies that prescribed what women could wear. They couldn't wear pantsuits, for example, or shorts, except in athletic competitions. That they had to be in the dormitory by a certain hour. That on some campuses, the policy was that the students couldn't drink, even though it might be legal for them to drink. If they were in a dormitory that was owned by the college, they were not allowed to consume alcoholic beverages. All that sort of thing was really putting the university or the college in the place of the parents. Gradually, most colleges decided they could live without such policies. The in loco parentis policies went out the window in the second half of the 20th century, and you'll find that universities and colleges do routinely find policies that they identify as no longer needed, and then they're discarded. Sometimes the lack of policy can create problems. The lack of careful admissions policies at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana clearly contributed to the problems there. It's interesting to me that the failing at the University of Illinois was not created by people trying to feather their own nests. As far as I know, nobody got rich off the practice, which became a prevailing practice, of giving certain people special privileges in terms of admission to highly selective programs. Everybody was doing this really to benefit the university. The idea was, if we cut a little slack for this applicant because his father is a state senator or because he's a large contributor to the university will benefit. So people were making exceptions to the rules for, they thought, the good of the cause. The trustees, when they found out about what was going on, claimed to have no knowledge of the situation, and they probably didn't have any knowledge of the situation, and they thought that exonerated them from any responsibility, and that's what they said. They didn't feel it was their responsibility, this scandal that had developed. But in fact, it was their responsibility, because by not laying down the right policies at the right time, the trustees opened the door to the president, and the president then opened the door to others on the campus to make these exceptions and create a kind of unfairness in the admissions process that created a bad taste in the mouth of the people of Illinois and lost a lot of prestige for the University of Illinois. So here's a case where it isn't that we have policies that we don't need anymore and are to discard. It's rather just the opposite. It's the idea that we've got situations that are vulnerable to certain kinds of unfortunate happenings, misfirings, and no policies in place to prevent that sort of thing from happening. Now, you'll find sometimes as academic administrators, trustees asking you, do we have the right policies in place? And that requires you to foresee, to look into the future. A very difficult thing to do. It was Yogi Berra who said that predictions are difficult, particularly when they involve the future. But that's exactly what you have to do as a academic administrator. You have to imagine what might go wrong and then create a policy that gives people some running room in terms of how they do their job, really a maximum amount of running room in terms of how they do their job, but at the same time lays down clear guidelines that keeps people from doing the kinds of things that will invite condemnation of the college or the university, or a misfiring of some sort or other. How to foresee what might go wrong in terms of an organizational setup is not an easy thing to do, but that's why you're enrolled in this program. And I think at the end of this week, or at least the hope is that by the end of this week, you will have a notion of some of the things to check. Is this going to get us in trouble with collective bargaining? Is it going to get us in trouble in terms of the faculty's expectations about their rights and privileges within the tradition of shared governance? Is this the kind of thing that will produce the kinds of results the trustees want in a way that's prudent and ethical and legal? These are the kinds of policies that you want to put in place, and these are the kinds of policies, admissions policies, that you might want to recommend to Michael Hogan as you complete your assignment for this week. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Several of you have done that already, and we've had some telephone conversations, some of us. So feel free to get in touch. You know how to reach me, and I would be happy to consult with you throughout the week if there's a particular question that you have about some aspect of the course in week 5. Good luck, and I think by the end of the week you'll be master policy makers. At least that's the hope. And we'll talk to you down the road.